Some winters don't announce themselves. They just slip in quiet, brittle, carrying a kind of cold that knows exactly where your old wounds are. That evening I felt it before I even stepped outside. The house had that strange stillness to it, the sort that settles right on your shoulders like a weight you forgot you were carrying. The street was calm, washed in that faint gold glow from porch lights and half-frozen wreaths. But something in the air held tight, as if the night itself was holding back a breath. I'd felt that kind of tension before years ago on a December night I've spent most of my life trying not to remember. I picked up the lights, untangling them slowly, letting my thoughts drift where I didn't want them to go. There are certain memories a man thinks he's managed to bury, but they don't stay buried. They wait. They know your weak spots. Sometimes all it takes is the scent of cold metal, or the way the wind whistles through the gutters to remind you of what you lost. And right as I reached for the first hook along the roofline, I heard Lily behind me. Small boots crunching against the frozen boards, her voice soft but steady. "Dad, why don't we visit Grandma anymore? There are questions in life that cut clean through the present and go straight for the part of you you've spent decades trying to patch up." Hers did exactly that, and in the quiet that followed I knew there was no hiding from what was coming. Because some answers don't thaw with time. Some stay frozen exactly where you left them. In my case, inside a voicemail from 2003. The ladder wobbled beneath my boots as I worked another strand of lights along the gutter. Evening settled over the neighborhood in that blue, breath-holding way December sometimes has, when sounds seem sharper and the cold feels like it's waiting for something to happen. I heard Lily's steps in the snow before I saw her. Small, quick, a little hesitant. I figured she was coming to ask about the missing red ornament box or whether we could bake cookies before bed. She stopped beside me and tugged at my jacket. When I looked down, her face was turned up toward mine, serious in a way a 9-year-old's face shouldn't have to be. "Dad, why don't we visit Grandma Judith anymore?" The question hit with a quiet force I wasn't ready for. Not this year. Not any year. The cold slipped under my coat and took its time settling in. I stood there halfway down the ladder, one hand on the rail, feeling 22 years of silence pressing against my ribs like something trapped behind glass. I tried to answer with a smile, something soft, something that would let her walk away without carrying any part of this weight. But the smile wouldn't stay. She watched me for a moment, searching my face the way kids do when they sense something they can't name. A lady called last week from a strange number. She sounded old. She sounded scared. She told me not to look for her. Then she hung up. The strand of light slipped from my fingers and swung gently in the cold air. My hands felt empty and raw. I stepped down and rested a hand on Lily's shoulder. Told her to head inside and warm up. She hesitated, worried, then nodded and walked toward the porch. She turned back once, like she wasn't sure leaving me there was the right thing to do. In the garage, the light bulb flickered once before holding steady. The familiar smell of cardboard dust and old winters wrapped around me. On the top shelf sat a box I had not touched since the year everything went wrong. My mother's ornament box. I pulled it down the cardboard, sighing a little as it shifted in my hands. Inside were the small things she always placed on the tree first. A felt stocking worn at the corners, a chipped ceramic snowman, a pine sachet that somehow still held a faint lingering scent of the holidays she tried so hard to make ours. I held the stocking a while. The room was quiet except for the heater in the corner and the distant hum of traffic beyond the neighborhood. The stocking felt lighter than I remembered, almost fragile. Maybe I was the one who had changed. Snow tapped gently against the garage door, soft and rhythmic. I closed the box carefully and set it back where it belonged. or maybe where I needed it to stay just one more night. Inside the house glowed warm behind the windows. Claire was in the kitchen, moving around with the easy rhythm she had when she cooked on winter evenings. Lily's voice drifted faintly from the living room, pretending her toy village people were deciding on holiday plans. The tree stood lit in the corner, steady and patient. The old radio near the fireplace crackled once and offered a familiar melody into the air. "I'll be home for Christmas." The song filled the room with a tenderness that cut deeper than I expected. I stepped closer to the tree, hands in my pockets, breath slow and uneven. Lily looked up at me from the floor. "Dad, is Grandma okay?" I lowered myself beside her, though I still couldn't find words. My palm settled on my knee, fingers curling slightly without meaning to. The lights reflected in the window behind her, small and blurred. She watched me for a moment, waiting, then gently placed one of her wooden figures next to a tiny painted lamppost in her village scene. The gesture was soft, careful, as if she understood more than she should. The house grew still. Even the radio seemed to quiet itself between notes. I sat there, feeling the cold from outside lingering in my chest. For years I had told myself there was no point in reopening what had already broken me once. But Lily's question had cracked something in a way time couldn't mend. I stood after a while and walked to the front window. Snow was beginning to gather on the path, soft and clean, covering the place where so many winters ago I had stood with no answers and too much fear. The glass felt cold beneath my fingertips. There are moments when life turns without warning, when the past stops waiting politely at the edges and steps into the room whether you are ready or not. This felt like one of those moments. The night outside grew deeper and the warmth of the house stayed behind me like a boundary I wasn't sure I could cross again. I stayed there a long time, listening to the soft movements of my family behind me, and the quiet of the snow settling ahead of me, knowing the door I shut 22 years ago was opening whether I wanted it to or not. The snow outside the window softened and blurred until it looked almost identical to the memory rising in my chest. The heater hummed through the vents, steady and low, and that sound pulled me backward before I could resist it. It always did. It carried me straight to another winter, another kitchen, another night when I was too young and too sure of myself to notice how close everything was to breaking. In December of 2003, I was 26, the kind of stubborn only a man who thinks he knows the world can be. My hands were always scraped from sheet metal, my clothes dusted with insulation. I came home tired, head full of work orders and bills, believing fatigue gave me the right to be short-tempered. Back then I thought responsibility meant carrying weight alone, not listening when someone else needed help. That evening I walked into my mother's kitchen, still wearing my jacket. The house smelled faintly of detergent and warmed air, but something was off. She stood at the counter sorting papers. And when she heard me enter, she stacked them a little too quickly, not enough to call attention to it, but enough for me to notice. Her shoulders were tense in a way I didn't understand at the time. She asked how work was. I said it was fine. She tried to smile, but her eyes drifted to the back door with that unfocused look people get when they are listening for something only they can hear. I followed her gaze toward the frosted window pane. The glass caught the kitchen light and made the darkness outside look deeper than usual. I felt her unease, even if I didn't yet know what it meant. She said she needed to talk about Silver Pines. She handled the books there and had for years. She said things weren't right. The numbers didn't match. Files had changed. A name she never signed appeared on a record that kept showing up on her desk. She spoke slowly, like she was picking each word carefully, afraid of choosing the wrong one. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated and rested her hand lightly on the counter as if to steady herself. Her voice softened and then faded when she started to say she thought someone was watching her. She didn't finish the thought. Instead, she looked toward the back door again. Her breath came shorter, just enough for me to hear it. I should have leaned in. I should have taken a breath and asked her to start over. But all I heard was the exhaustion in my own bones. I felt myself getting irritated the way young men do when they don't want to confront something heavy. I told her she was overthinking, that she always jumped to the worst case. My tone was sharper than I intended, but once the words left my mouth, there was no pulling them back. She tried again, quieter. She said she found something she should never have found, and her name was suddenly attached to a file that wasn't hers. She said it wasn't a simple error. Her fingers trembled slightly when she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I see it clearly now, but then I barely noticed. The tension in the kitchen felt tight as wire. I pushed away from the counter and walked toward the door without waiting for her to finish. I stepped into the cold, letting the air sting my cheeks. The screen door shut behind me with a dull clap. Snow landed on my sleeves and melted into small dark patches. I stood in her yard, listening to the quiet, trying to convince myself I had done the reasonable thing, that she was stressed and needed rest, that I was right to step outside and breathe. But something in me twitched. I turned back toward the kitchen window. The blinds were half open. Through the glass, I saw her standing alone in the dim room. Her hand came up to her face, wiping away tears she didn't want me to see. She exhaled slowly and reached for the kitchen switch. The light snapped off. Her silhouette softened into the glow from the hallway. For a moment, she seemed so small, as if the room itself had shrunk around her. I stayed outside longer than I should have. Snow settled on my hair on the steps on the railing of the small porch. Somewhere down the street, a car door shut and a dog barked once before quieting. I listened to the silence and felt something tighten inside me, a pull that told me to go back in. To ask her to explain, to tell her I was there, but I didn't move. Later, I sat on her couch while she folded laundry. The television played a holiday commercial full of cheerful families sharing casseroles and pies under bright lights. She moved carefully, smoothing the edges of each towel, aligning them in stacks on the coffee table. She didn't say much. Neither did I. The quiet between us felt heavier than anything on the screen. She asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. She said it softly, a little hesitant. I told her I had an early shift. She nodded, though the nod felt like a small door closing. She put the folded clothes away and walked me to the front door. She locked it behind me, once, then again. The sound was quiet but distinct. I had never noticed her locking it twice before. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked to my truck. For a moment, I looked back at her house. The porch light glowed against the winter night, but the windows were dark. I told myself she would call tomorrow, that whatever troubled her would settle with morning light. But the call never came. And the next time I drove up that street, the porch light flashed red and blue across the snow. That night was the last moment I saw her standing in her own home. The last moment before silence took hold of both our lives. The last moment before everything shifted into a darkness I am still trying to understand. The cold from that night in 2003 never really left me. Sometimes it returns in small ways, the way a draft sneaks through an old window, or the way the heater hums in a quiet room long after midnight. That was how it began for me, standing in my apartment after a long shift, waiting for the warmth to finally reach my hands. The room was dim except for the soft glow from the kitchen, and I moved without much thought, dropping my keys on the counter and rubbing life back into my fingers. The day had drained me. I was ready for sleep, not for anything more complicated than that. My phone buzzed once against the counter. I almost ignored it. Then I saw her name. The timestamp pulled at me. Close to midnight. My mother never called at that hour. I pressed play with the quiet expectation that she might have needed something, a ride to the store in the morning or help with the thermostat. Instead, I heard her breathing fast and thin as if she was trying to stay hidden in her own house. The sound rooted me where I stood. She spoke in a whisper so strained it felt fragile. She said something at Silver Pines was wrong. Records had changed. Money was missing. She said her name was on a file she never touched. Then she paused as if choosing between speaking and keeping herself safe. When she said the name Richardson, her voice tightened around it like it was something sharp. The room around me seemed to shrink and settle into silence, so deep I could hear my own pulse. I listened harder and leaned against the counter as if I needed the support. The heater rattled through the vent and made the whole apartment feel smaller. My mother tried to say more, but the sound behind her swallowed the next words. A short cry cut through the static. It was faint but unmistakable enough to make me lift my head. It sounded like a child startled awake. I remember blinking at the phone, unsure if exhaustion was playing tricks on me. She lived alone. That kind of detail lands in the mind like a stone dropped into deep water. I replayed the moment, holding the phone a little tighter. The cry came again, and then everything inside the voicemail bent toward chaos. Something hit the floor, a chair maybe. Feet shuffled fast, then a man's voice, low and urgent, told someone to grab her phone. The message snapped off so abruptly the silence after it felt louder than the noise before. I dialed her number. Once, twice, the line rang but never connected. By the third try, I felt something in me shifting out of reason and into instinct. When the fourth attempt failed, I stopped thinking altogether. Panic, when it is real, does not announce itself. It simply takes over your legs and moves them for you. I pulled my coat on, nearly dropping the sleeve, and stepped into the hallway before I had a full plan in my head. Outside, the snow was falling harder than earlier. The flakes glowed through the streetlights and drifted sideways in the wind. I scraped the windshield with my arm instead of the scraper, too rattled to care. The truck engine coughed and then steadied. I pulled out of the lot with the headlights carving narrow paths through the swirling white. Each breath felt too shallow. Each thought came too late. I tried to tell myself she might be all right, that maybe she panicked over something small and exaggerated it in fear. But then that cry replayed in my mind again, soft but wrong. No explanation fit. No part of me could make peace with the idea that she was safe. I held the wheel tighter and leaned forward slightly, as if getting closer to the road would bring me closer to understanding any of it. The roads were slick and partially covered the plows nowhere in sight. Christmas lights on the houses I passed looked blurred, almost trembling behind the curtain of snow. I slowed as I reached an intersection where the traffic light flickered. A man in a thick coat walked across the street holding a paper bag against his chest. He moved with the steady confidence of someone whose night had not been interrupted by fear. I watched him for a brief second, feeling the difference between his world and mine in a way that was almost painful. When the light changed, I drove on. The familiar turns toward her neighborhood came faster than I wanted, each one pulling at something deeper in me. My thoughts kept darting back to her kitchen, the way she had looked past me hours earlier, the way her voice wavered. The details landed like blows I had no way of softening. I slowed as I turned onto her street. The snow seemed untouched, smooth and heavy over the pavement. A few houses kept their lights on, warm yellow squares shining through curtains. Someone's wreath hung crooked on a door. A radio played faint Christmas music somewhere far off. All of it should have felt comforting, but the quiet carried a weight I could not ignore. As I approached her driveway, my stomach tightened. I parked at the curb and let the engine idle for a few seconds. The truck's heater hummed weakly. I could almost imagine her inside, pacing, waiting, relieved to hear my steps. But the fear clung too closely to breathe that thought for long. I stepped out into the snow. The cold bit into my cheeks and found its way under my collar. The house looked still, as if holding its breath. I walked toward the front porch slowly, each crunch of snow under my boots louder than the last. Something in the air felt suspended, like the moment before a storm fully breaks. I reached the first step and paused. A faint glow from her living room window flickered once, or maybe it was just the snow shifting against the glass. I stood there listening. Nothing moved. Nothing called out. The silence felt unnatural, as if the house itself was waiting for me to discover something I was not ready to see. I lifted my hand toward the doorknob, hesitating just a heartbeat before I touched the cold metal, and for that small moment the world around me seemed to hold perfectly still. The metal of the doorknob was colder than I expected. Colder than the night itself, and just as my fingers brushed it, a harsh burst of red and blue light washed over the porch. I turned toward the street, blinking through the snowfall as the flicker settled into the shape of police cruisers pulling up against the curb. Their tires cut deep tracks in the fresh snow, and the sound of doors slamming shut cracked the quiet open like ice under a boot. Officers moved around the house with the stiff coordination of people following instructions they didn't fully agree with. Their breath came out in quick clouds, white against the flashing lights. One of them held out a hand to stop me before I reached the steps. His voice was firm but strained. "Sir, you need to stay back. There's an active scene here. Active scene." The word sat wrong in my ear. My mother's porch was no crime scene, not an hour earlier, not ever. I tried to step around him, but a second officer blocked me, this one older. His jaw tight under the brim of his hat. He said my mother had left voluntarily after some kind of disturbance inside. His tone was calm, in the way people sound when they have rehearsed every line. Behind him, a younger officer kept glancing at the porch, then at me, then away again, as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. The older one repeated that there was no threat, no struggle. She had simply walked away. I told him she never walked anywhere without her gloves in winter. I told him she called me less than an hour before. I told him something was wrong. He didn't answer, only shifted his weight like my words made him uncomfortable. A gust of wind carried snow across the porch, and that was when I saw it. A dark smear near the threshold, just large enough to catch the light. It wasn't frozen solid yet, still tacky at the edges where the cold hadn't finished its work. One of the officers called it spilled wine. He didn't bend to look. He didn't even pause. Just stated it like a fact he needed to get out of the way. I crouched and touched the edge with a fingertip. The thickness of it, the way it clung to the wood, told me what they didn't want to say. The snow drifted toward it as if trying to erase it before I could understand what it meant. Through the front window, the living room glowed faintly. Her wool gloves sat neatly on the table near the couch. They looked almost posed, palms up, fingers slightly curled. She had worn those gloves longer than I could remember. She grabbed them even when checking the mail. Seeing them there untouched made the house feel suddenly hollow, as if the warmth that once filled it had slipped out through some crack I couldn't find. I asked to go inside, but the older officer stepped closer until his coat brushed mine. His voice dropped lower. "Sir, we can't let you in. We're finishing up. Please head home and wait for an update." The younger officer shifted again, his eyes flicking toward the porch, and for a moment I caught something human in them. Something uneasy. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then shut it when the senior officer glanced his way. Neighbors began emerging swiftly from doorways, wrapped in robes and jackets, watching from behind fences or over railings. Their Christmas lights blinked behind them, small and oblivious. Someone further down the street held a mug close to their chin, steam rising into the air like a quiet question. No one spoke. The scene felt too fragile for sound. An ambulance sat idling at the end of the driveway, but no one was inside, no one waiting with a stretcher. Its headlights cut long streaks through the falling snow. I felt myself moving toward it without thinking, needing to know if she had been taken somewhere, if her name was on a chart, if someone had seen her face. But an officer called out sharply, stopping me before I reached the hood. "Sir, go home. We will contact you." The house behind him seemed smaller than I remembered. The porch light flickered once and then steadied. I tried to stand still to slow my breathing, but something inside me kept pacing. I thought of her kitchen earlier that night, the light switching off, her silhouette shrinking into the hallway glow. The fear that had crept into her voice on the voicemail. All of it pressed together in my chest, cold and heavy. It took almost an hour before they cleared out. One cruiser pulled away, then another. The older officer stepped into the snow, his boots sinking deep. He told me again that she left voluntarily. He said the case file was being transferred upstate. He said it like the words meant nothing, like they were routine, but in my gut they landed like a warning. Transferred upstate, a phrase that felt like a curtain dropping between me and the truth. It was the kind of line you hear when someone wants a trail to fade, when a file is pushed so far out of reach, you could spend a lifetime trying to find it again. When the last car retreated down the street, the silence folded back into place. The house stood there in the dim light, dark windows staring out at nothing. Snow drifted across the porch, soft and relentless, creeping toward the dark stain until it began to fade beneath the white. The wind made a low sound, almost like a breath. I stepped closer. My hand hovered near the doorknob again, but this time I didn't touch it. I only stood there, feeling the cold seep through the wood and into my skin, as if the house itself had gone hollow, as if it was already forgetting she had ever lived there at all. The snow kept falling, slow and determined, erasing every sign of the woman whose warnings I hadn't listened to. Her gloves sent behind the window, still waiting on the table untouched. I stayed there until the last cruiser disappeared, until the wind grew sharper, until the weight of silence pressed too deeply to ignore. Then I stepped back, breath unsteady, and let the night close around me like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The snow that night settled over my mother's porch as if trying to seal it from memory, and for years afterward I carried that same heavy quiet inside me. Every December it rose again, a slow ache in my chest, almost like breathing in smoke from a fire I couldn't put out. Christmas lights on the neighbors' houses always made me think of those cruiser lights staining the snow, and of the voicemail that had carved itself into me so deeply I still sometimes woke hearing her whisper. For a long time I convinced myself it was better to keep everything buried. I threw myself into work, into fixing other people's furnaces and water heaters, anything that made the days predictable. Claire tried to pull me into holiday dinners with her family, tried to create the kind of Christmas she thought would soften the years between us and the past I would not touch. I sat through it, hands wrapped around a mug of cider or a glass of wine, nodding at conversations I didn't fully hear. The heat from the kitchen, the smell of pine, the soft glow of the tree, all of it pushed me back into that winter in a way I never admitted aloud. One evening, years after Lily was born, I found myself standing in the doorway of the attic, with the old ornament box in my hands. The cardboard had softened with age, and the pine sachet inside still carried a faint trace of the holidays my mother used to build around us. Claire found me there, staring at a felt stocking, and she touched my arm gently, as if afraid the moment might crumble. She said I couldn't keep holding everything alone. She said truth weighs less when shared. I didn't answer, but her words stayed with me. It wasn't until this past December, when Lily asked about her grandmother and that strange call came in, that I finally climbed the attic stairs again with purpose instead of habit. I sat on the floor with the ornament box beside me and pulled out the laptop I had avoided for 2 decades. It was silver scuffed at the edges, the kind of old machine that belonged to another life. When I opened it, the faint smell of dust rose like a reminder of everything I tried to forget. Claire stayed nearby, sitting on the bed with a blanket pulled around her shoulders. She didn't say anything this time. She just watched the screen with me as it flickered to life. The old desktop background was still there, a picture of a winter trail behind silver pines that we used to walk together. Snow hanging in the branches, a soft blue sky. The kind of quiet morning she loved. I clicked through old folders, half expecting everything to be empty. Then I saw it. A folder tucked between others, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. 3. Judith. My chest tightened as I hovered the cursor over it. The room felt colder despite the heater running through the vents. When I opened it, 3 audio files appeared. 2 of them were marked corrupted. The third was strangely intact. The date beside it read December 2003. But the detail that stopped me was the last accessed line. 2008. I stared at the number as if it were a misprint. I had never touched this laptop after that winter. I had locked it away and tried to force the memories into silence. Someone else had opened that file. Someone who knew it existed. I clicked it and let it play. It wasn't the voicemail. It was something quieter. My mother speaking to herself, recording a list of numbers and names in a whisper meant for no one to hear. Then her voice broke. She said she was scared. She said she didn't know who to trust anymore. She said if anything happened to her, someone needed to look beyond the surface. The recording cut abruptly, the last few seconds warped into static. Claire touched my shoulder lightly. Her voice was almost a whisper. Who opened it? I shook my head. I didn't have an answer. The next morning, after dropping Lily at school, I drove to the only place I thought might still hold a trace of the truth. The old police precinct. It had been remodeled, new tenants inside now, but standing in the parking lot pulled me back to every unanswered question I had pushed aside. I knew I wasn't going to find answers there, but I needed something to move me toward the next step. There was one person who might remember. Sam Harrington, a retired detective who had known my mother better than most people did. He used to come by the house after long shifts, always with that tired half smile and a quiet nod. He respected her. She trusted him. If anyone had seen where the investigation went wrong or who had shut it down, it would be Sam. I searched his number and found a listing in a small town 2 hours north. I hesitated before calling. It felt strange to reach for a voice from a past I had never made peace with. But something in that old laptop pulsed through me like a signal. I pressed call. The phone rang once, then again. On the third ring, I heard a click and the sound of someone breathing. The air on the line felt heavy, like he already knew who it was before I spoke. When he said hello, his voice carried years of exhaustion and something else I could not name. Sam, it's Marcus. I need to ask you something about my mother. There was a long pause. I heard him shift, maybe sitting down, maybe bracing himself. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped into something almost resigned. I've been waiting for this. Those words hung between us, quiet and final, as if they belonged to a moment he knew would eventually come, no matter how many years passed. I stepped outside into the cold air. The sky low and gray, and for the first time since that winter, I felt the ground beneath everything shift. The past wasn't gone. It had been waiting, and somewhere inside that waiting, the truth was still alive, unfinished. The cold clung to me long after I ended the call with Sam. I stood in the driveway beside my truck, the afternoon sky low and colorless, as if the day itself was holding its breath. The wind carried the faint scent of pine from a neighbor's wreath, and for a moment it pulled me back to that ornament box in the attic, the one I still hadn't put away. It was strange how every road that winter seemed to lead in circles, always back to her, always back to the silence she left behind. I drove north toward Sam's town, the sun already slipping behind the hills even though it wasn't yet evening. Christmas decorations blinked in store windows as I passed through some towns, each one a reminder of holidays. I never learned how to celebrate again. The heater hummed through the vents, steady but not quite warm enough. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the folded paper where I'd scribbled Sam's address, as if touching it grounded me somehow. His house sat at the end of a narrow road lined with bare trees and patches of snow that hadn't fully melted. It looked more like a cabin than the home of a former detective, a small place tucked against the woods with smoke rising siltly from the chimney. When I stepped out of the truck, the scent of burning oak drifted through the air. A quiet place for a man who had seen too much. Sam answered the door before I knocked twice. His hair had thinned, his shoulders rounded, but his eyes were sharp in the way of men who never stop noticing things. He nodded once as if we'd spoken yesterday and motioned for me to come inside. The warmth hit me first, then the smell of coffee and wood. He poured a cup into a chipped mug without asking and set it on the table between us. For a while we didn't speak. Sam stared at the steam rising from his cup. I stared at the small Christmas tree in the corner of the room, covered in simple white lights. It looked like the kind of tree someone decorated out of habit, not joy. He finally broke the silence. Your mother's file never disappeared. It was buried. There's a difference. His voice was low, not angry, but tired in a way that hinted at years of carrying something he couldn't put down. He told me he had tried to push the investigation in 2003, but every request he filed came back stamped and redirected until it vanished into offices far above his reach. He said names he'd worked with for years suddenly avoided him. Doors in the department closed faster than he could knock. The more questions he asked, the more he was told to let it go. People were protecting someone, he said, and they were scared enough to do it thoroughly. He pushed a folder toward me. It wasn't thick, but it felt heavy when I picked it up. Inside were photocopies of forms from my mother's case, all marked with lines of black ink details, redacted until the truth was barely visible. But one detail hadn't been scrubbed out. An address change. My address. According to the department's records, I had moved out of state in 2004. I sat back a little, the absurdity of it hitting harder than I expected. Sam explained in that steady voice that someone wanted the trail clean. My presence in town complicated the narrative they needed. If I existed somewhere else on paper, no one would ask why I wasn't interviewed or kept informed. It was a misdirection, he said gently, to keep you safe or to keep you isolated. I haven't decided which. He stood and walked toward the window, his hands resting on the sill. Snowflakes drifted outside in slow, loose patterns. He said Richardson had been a quiet force in those days, a man who built influence through donations and backroom loyalty. Judges, council members, a few in law enforcement who owed him favors, enough people to make inconvenient truths disappear. When I asked if he thought Richardson was behind everything, Sam didn't answer at first. He just watched the snowfall, the reflection of white light flickering across his glasses. Your mother wasn't the only one who tried to stand against him, he finally said. There was another, someone who fought him hard enough that she paid dearly for it, someone who knew exactly what your mother feared. He walked back to the table and opened a drawer, pulling out a slip of paper folded into thirds. He flattened it with the edge of his hand and slid it toward me. Her name is Victoria Sloan, his ex-wife, the only person who ever left him and tried to expose what he was doing. The handwriting on the page was jagged, as if written in a hurry. A rural address, a town I had never heard of. Sam leaned back in his chair and said she lived far from everything now, that she trusted very few people, and certainly none connected to Richardson. He warned me that she might not open her door if she saw a stranger approaching. But she knows what your mother knew, and she might be the last living person who does. He said it calmly, but something in the way he looked at me made the room feel smaller, as if the walls were holding a truth he didn't want to say outright. I folded the paper and slipped it into my jacket pocket. As I reached for my coat to leave, Sam stopped me with a hand on my arm. His grip was firmer than I expected. He held my eyes for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, the weight of his words settled into me like winter itself. Your mother wasn't running from you. The room was quiet after that. Even the fire in the stove seemed to pause its crackling. I stood there longer than I meant to, not trusting my voice enough to respond. Outside, the snow had begun falling again, soft and steady, covering the tire tracks leading back to the road. I stepped out into the cold, hearing the door close behind me with a slow, deliberate click. And the echo of Sam's words followed me all the way to the truck. The road to Victoria's town stretched through miles of open fields, the snow drifting in long sheets across the asphalt like something alive. By the time I reached the outskirts, the daylight had thinned into a pale gray that made the world feel distant. My hands tightened on the wheel more than once, not from the cold, but from the weight of Sam's last words settling deeper with every mile. Your mother wasn't running from you. A truth like that doesn't loosen its grip quickly. Her house sat at the far edge of a neglected cul-de-sac, half hidden behind tall pines and drifts of old snow hardened into uneven mounds. A thin stream of smoke rose from the chimney, but no lights showed through the windows. The driveway hadn't been cleared in days. I parked at the bottom and walked the rest of the way, my boots sinking into the untouched snow. Each step made a crisp sound that felt loud in the quiet. When I reached the porch, I hesitated. Something about the stillness of the place made me think I was being watched. I knocked anyway. A few seconds passed, then the sound of locks turning one by one. 3 in total. The door cracked open just enough for one eye to look out. She didn't speak at first. Her gaze moved over my face, down my coat to my hands. Not judging, assessing, like someone who had learned the cost of trusting the wrong person. She asked my name quietly, and when I told her, she opened the door a few inches more. She stepped back only after I said Sam's name. Her posture changed then, not welcoming but no longer defensive. She let me in with a small gesture. The house felt warmer than I expected. Heat rolled from a wood stove in the corner, and the scent of cedar mingled with something faintly metallic like the smell of old keys. Christmas lights hung along the mantel, but none were plugged in. A tree stood in the far corner, undecorated except for a single white ribbon tied near the top. She motioned for me to sit at a small table near the window. Her movements were deliberate, careful, like someone trying not to disturb the air itself. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tightness along the edges. She said she knew this day would come, though she had hoped it wouldn't be me standing there, because it meant the past had been stirred up again. She told me my mother reached out to her during the last days before she vanished, when the threats had shifted from warnings to promises. Richardson's people had begun mentioning my name in conversations meant to scare her into slants. My stomach tightened at that. I didn't interrupt. Victoria's eyes never left mine as she spoke, as if making sure I absorbed every word. She stood, walked to a narrow cabinet, and returned with an old ledger pressed against her chest like something fragile. She set it gently on the table. The cover was cracked at the corners and the edges of the pages had yellowed. She said it contained the original financial records from Silver Pines pulled by my mother in secret. Fraudulent Medicare charges, ghost patients, fake treatments, all threaded back to one name: Richardson. I opened the ledger carefully, letting my fingers run along the columns of dates and amounts. Some entries were circled in red pen, others underlined twice the handwriting, unmistakably my mother's. In the margins she had written notes, names. Crossed out words she must have stopped herself from writing fully. Victoria watched me read, then placed something else on the table. A small silver USB drive. The number 47 etched into one side. She said my mother had given it to her the night everything collapsed, the night she realized she couldn't stay in town another day. Keep it safe until someone comes. Those were her instructions. Victoria admitted she never knew if that someone would arrive or if the truth would die in that drawer. Her voice shook slightly as she repeated the last thing my mother ever said to her. "If I disappear, protect my son." The words hung between us, heavy enough to settle into the floorboards. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, like the air had turned too thick. Victoria sat back, her shoulders dropping in a way that made her look older than she had at the door. She confessed she still carried guilt for not doing more, even though she knew she had done everything she could. Richardson had already turned his attention toward her by then. She showed me a photograph tucked in the ledger, a faded image of her from years ago, bruised around one eye. She said it wasn't the worst of it, not by a long shot. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows, rattling them softly. A car passed on the main road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the snow outside before disappearing. The room seemed to grow smaller with each passing moment. When I finally slid the USB into my pocket, she drew a long breath and warned me that once I opened it, everything would change. It would make me a witness, not an observer. Someone who carried proof, and proof in stories like this didn't just expose the guilty, it marked the living. I stood slowly, unsure of what to say. She walked me to the door, her hand hovering near the frame, the way someone stands ready to lock it again the moment it closes. She looked at me with something like pity or caution. Maybe both. "Be careful who knows you came here," she said softly. "And be careful who wants to know." The air outside felt colder than before. I stepped down the porch steps, hearing the locks slide back into place behind me, each one snapping shut with a precision that told me she had rehearsed this ritual for years. At the bottom of the driveway, I looked back once. A faint glow from the stove flickered through the curtains, then dimmed. The snow under my boots barely made a sound as I walked to the truck. When I started the engine, the dashboard lights reflected faintly off the silver USB in my pocket. Something had shifted. I could feel it settling around me like the winter air, quiet but impossible to ignore. I drove home from Victoria's place long after the sun had disappeared the sky, a sheet of dark steel stretching over the empty highway. Her warning stayed with me the whole way back. Be careful who knows you came here. The silver USB in my pocket felt heavier than it should have, as if the metal had absorbed the weight of everything she didn't say. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other pressed against my coat, reminding myself it was still there, reminding myself I wasn't imagining any of this. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet except for the hum of the furnace working against the cold. Claire and Lily had gone to bed. The Christmas lights on the porch flickered, feebly casting small blue reflections across the snow. For a moment I stood at the front door, my breath fogging in the air, as I tried to convince myself to wait until morning. But sleep wasn't going to find me that night, not with that USB sitting in my pocket like a pulse. I walked through the kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath my boots, and made my way out to the garage. The air inside was sharp enough to sting my nose. Tools hung on the walls, their shadows stretched across the concrete by the single bulb overhead. The workbench where I used to fix old air compressors and dryer belts stood against the far wall, covered in dust and a few stray screws. It felt like the right place to open something that might break my life open again. I sat on the stool, plugged the USB into the laptop sitting on the bench, and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence felt colder than the room. Then a single folder appeared on the screen, its name. Nothing more than the number 47. My hands hesitated over the trackpad before I clicked. The first file was audio, only a few seconds long. At first it sounded like static, then it sharpened into voices. A man spoke with the calm detachment of someone giving an order at a board meeting rather than arranging something sinister. Handle Judith before Christmas and make sure the boy stays out of sight. No emotion, no hesitation, just instruction. The voice was unmistakably Richardson's, the same voice I had heard in town halls growing up. The same man who used to shake hands with local business owners like he was blessing the place. The way he said the boy made something inside me lock up. I found myself gripping the edge of the workbench until my knuckles turned white. I replayed the clip twice, hating the steady, unbothered rhythm of his voice. The heater kicked on somewhere inside the house, but out in the garage, the cold stayed still and unforgiving. The second file was longer, a scanned set of documents with dates, signatures, billing codes, and a child's name that appeared again and again. A supposed resident at Silver Pines, aged 3. I scrolled slowly, feeling each page sink deeper into my chest. The entries lined up exactly with what Victoria had told me. Fraudulent Medicare billing, services charged for a child who never existed, cross-referenced with shifts my mother worked. And at the bottom of one page, a notation scribbled in the same handwriting I had seen in her ledger. Stop this before someone gets hurt. The child's cry from the voicemail flashed through my mind with a clarity that made me stop breathing for a second. A sound that shouldn't have been in that house. A voice that shouldn't have existed. Richardson's voice ordering someone to handle her. The timeline was no longer just suspicion. It was a map drawn in proof. The documents were detailed enough to bypass any friendly local official. Enough to explain why someone had revisited the files in 2008. Enough to make sense of why Sam had been silenced. Enough to make me realize my mother hadn't been paranoid or dramatic or overwhelmed. She had been right. And she had been in danger long before I ever heard that voicemail. I sat there for a long moment staring at the screen. The cold had numbed my fingers, but the pressure behind my eyes burned. The garage was so quiet I could hear the wind pressing against the siding. Somewhere inside the house, the refrigerator hummed on and off, a small reminder that the normal world still existed while mine kept tilting. I knew I had to take the evidence to someone who couldn't be bought. Someone whose authority reached beyond whatever circles Richardson controlled. Sam had given me a number years ago, a contact he trusted more than anyone else. I scrolled through my phone until I found it. Agent Miriam Lockley. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was steady, clipped, the kind of tone people use when they've heard every version of a disaster. I told her my name. I told her I had evidence related to an ongoing Medicare fraud case and a potential disappearance. She didn't interrupt once. When I paused trying to find the right words, she simply said, "Bring it to my office at 9 and do not speak to anyone else about this." Her certainty rattled me. It was the first time in 22 years someone in authority hadn't dismissed what I said. The next morning I drove downtown with the USB in my jacket, stepping into a federal building that felt too bright after the dimness of the garage. Miriam met me in a small office with file boxes stacked against the walls. She didn't shake my hand, just motioned for me to sit and plug in the drive. She listened to the recordings without changing expression. When Richardson's voice played through the speakers, she leaned forward slightly. When the scanned documents appeared, she scribbled notes, pausing only once to ask where I had gotten them. I told her. She didn't press further. "This isn't just fraud," she said quietly. "This is conspiracy and witness tampering. Potentially attempted homicide." Her voice wasn't emotional, but something about the precision of her words made the room feel colder. She asked for the ledger. She asked for the voicemail if I still had it. She asked whether anyone else knew I had been digging. Her questions were methodical, the kind that come from someone used to chasing long-buried truths. When I left the building, the winter sun hung low and colorless over the parking lot. Cars passed on the street, their tires hissing over the slush. I stood beside my truck for a moment, feeling the cold seep into my sleeves, and it struck me how long justice takes to move. How slow and heavy it becomes when darkness has had years to root itself into people and systems. But the files were out of my hands now. The truth wasn't locked in an attic or a ledger or a USB anymore. It had finally begun to move, and somewhere beneath all that winter air I felt the faintest shift, like the first crack of thaw beneath snow. The morning after I left the evidence with Miriam felt strangely hollow, as if the house had been emptied of sound. Even the furnace seemed quieter, humming in long, tired stretches that barely touched the cold, pressing against the windows. Claire moved around the kitchen softly so she wouldn't wake Lily, and I sat at the table staring at the faint scratches along the wood grain. My hands rested around a mug of coffee I barely tasted. January sunlight leaked weakly through the blinds, leaving pale stripes on the countertop. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. I kept waiting for the phone to ring, for some urgent update, for the truth to move faster than it had all these years. But the house stayed still. The whole world seemed to stay still. Miriam had warned me the night before that federal investigations weren't storms. They were winters, long, quiet, slow. She said it would take months to build something airtight. Months of tracing records, subpoenaing documents, cross-checking testimony, and climbing around whatever layers of influence Richardson had built. I tried to convince myself I was ready for that wait. But the truth was, I had never waited well in my life. By mid-January, the snow piled up along the driveway in uneven drifts. I shoveled it every other morning just to keep from thinking too much. The scrape of the metal blade across the concrete became a kind of rhythm, something steady in a season that offered no promises. Sometimes Lily watched from the window, her outline small behind the glass. She would wave and I would force a smile, though it didn't always reach my eyes. As weeks passed, the evidence I had turned over felt like a stone lodged in my chest. I woke each morning with the same restless feeling, the same question clawing at the back of my mind. Was it enough? Had I waited too long? Had I given the truth such a late start that it might never catch up? Winter bled slowly into spring, the snowbanks shrinking into gray, slushy piles before disappearing entirely. The yard turned soft and muddy and the trees budded early. I fixed the loose gutter on the side of the house and repaired a leak under the kitchen sink, anything to keep my hands busy. But nothing I did filled the space inside me where worry kept returning. Every night after Lily brushed her teeth and climbed under her blankets, she asked me the same question, in a voice too gentle for the weight it carried. "When can I meet Grandma?" Her eyes searched mine as if she suspected I was hiding something but didn't want to accuse me of the worst thing a child can imagine, not telling the truth. I kept my answer simple each time. "Not yet, sweetheart, but soon." The words felt thin. They tasted like something borrowed from another father, someone who wasn't walking around with a 22-year ache stitched into his ribs. Claire tried to keep some sense of hope alive in the house. She cooked more on weekends, letting the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary fill the rooms. She suggested small drives to clear our heads. She spoke about patience the way some people speak about prayer. But even she carried a quiet worry behind her smile. I saw it in the way her hands paused when she tied her apron, or in the way she looked toward me before answering Lily's questions. She wanted to believe justice had momentum. She wanted to believe the truth would land on our side. Summer settled in with heavy heat. The neighborhood kids rode their bikes up and down the street while the sound of lawnmowers drifted from yard to yard. I sat on the back porch most evenings, the boards warm beneath my boots, and watched the wind sink past the trees. Fireflies flickered along the fence line in the last of the daylight. The world kept moving, but I stayed caught between the past and whatever the future was building toward. Sometimes I caught myself imagining what my mother might look like if she were still out there somewhere. Whether her hair had turned fully gray, whether she still kept her gloves in the same drawer, whether she thought of me on those long winter nights. Those thoughts arrived uninvited, curling around my chest and refusing to let go. By August, the investigation had become a fact of life. A shadow I carried from room to room. Miriam called twice over the summer. Each time she explained that progress was being made, but carefully, quietly, without tipping off anyone who might still have reach in the wrong places. She spoke with the caution of someone who had seen cases collapse for less. "It'll come together," she kept saying. "But you need to give us room to work, room to breathe, room to let the past finally speak for itself." I tried. I really did. But there were days when the waiting felt like its own kind of punishment. By September, the air cooled again, the leaves turning early from the dryness of summer. One evening, I found myself in the garage staring at the half-finished shelf I had promised to build months earlier. The silver USB lay in a small box on the top shelf, wrapped in a cloth to keep it safe. I hadn't touched it since the day I handed everything to Miriam, but its presence felt like a heartbeat in the room. The phone rang the next afternoon while I was tightening the hinges on Lily's bedroom door. I nearly dropped the screwdriver. Claire looked up from the laundry basket, her eyes following mine toward the hallway. I answered with a voice that didn't feel like my own. "It's Lockley," Miriam said. I stepped into the living room, the floor creaking subtly under my feet, and pressed the phone tighter to my ear. For a moment, she didn't say anything else. I could hear papers shifting, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the distant echo of someone speaking in another office. Then she said, "It's coming together." 3 words. That was all. But they tightened something inside me so sharply I had to sit down. The phone felt warm against my hand. Relief and fear pulled hard in opposite directions, leaving me breathless between them. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't have to. Her tone carried the rest. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of the living room, the glow of the late afternoon stretching across the carpet. Dust floated in the sunlight like drifting snow. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. Something was moving. Something long buried was finally rising, and whatever waited on the other end of this slow winter was close enough now that I could feel it settling through the house like the first hint of a storm. The call from Miriam lingered in my mind for days, the 3 words settling into the spaces I had kept hollow for more than 2 decades. "It's coming together." I repeated them under my breath as December carried itself toward Christmas, with the same cold certainty it had in 2003. The air grew sharper each morning, the breath from my lungs rawing in faint white clouds that reminded me of nights spent waiting for answers that never came. On the night of December 21st, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the hum of the furnace and the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Claire stirred beside me more than once, turning as if she felt the shift happening beneath the quiet surface of our lives. Lily slept soundly, unaware of how close the past was to breaking open. I lay there until the first hint of dawn crept along the edges of the blinds. By the time I stepped outside the next morning, the sky held that pale winter blue that comes before snow. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. When I answered, Miriam's voice was steadier than the cold air around me. "It's happening. Now." She didn't offer details, and I didn't ask. Some moments build for years, and when they arrive, you recognize their shape without needing them described. Federal agents hit Richardson's estate at dawn. Later, I would learn there had been more than a dozen vehicles, their tires crushing the frost-coated gravel of his driveway. Agents moved through the property with a precision born from months of preparation and decades of secrets finally forced into daylight. At the same time, another team intercepted Colin Reddick at a private airstrip outside the county line. His plane was already warming, the propellers ticking like impatient fingers when they stopped him on the tarmac. I didn't see any of it myself, but I could feel it the way some people feel a storm break miles away. The house seemed to hold its breath around me, the walls absorbing every vibration in the air. I tried pacing the kitchen, but my steps felt too loud. I tried making coffee, but the sound of the spoon tapping the mug was jarring in the silence. At noon, the phone finally rang. I answered before it reached the second buzz. "We have him," Miriam said, "and he's talking." I stood there staring at the small wreath hanging on the pantry door, the red ribbon slightly crooked. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "What did he say?" She didn't hesitate. "Your mother was placed into protective custody hours before his people were scheduled to reach her. She survived by a margin so thin it shakes you even when you're trained not to react." I closed my eyes, my breath catching in my chest in a way I hadn't prepared for. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. The clatter of something falling somewhere in the house made me flinch. Claire stepped into the doorway, her eyes searching mine, and I shook my head once to keep her from asking anything yet. Miriam continued speaking, her tone careful, deliberate, as if she were choosing each word with precision. Reddick admitted a reward was circulated years after she entered Witsec. Not official, but enough to keep certain circles searching. Enough to confirm that the danger never really ended. The idea of strangers hunting for her across decades tightened something inside me. I pictured her alone, living under names that weren't hers, never knowing when the past might find her again. I asked if she was safe now. Miriam paused before answering, and that pause felt like a cold hand around my ribs. "Yes, she's safe. And there's more. We have confirmation she's alive. Witsec will coordinate the next step. Alive." The word moved through me with a force that made the kitchen blur for a moment. Claire's hand touched my arm, gently grounding me, and I nodded once, unable to speak. It felt like someone had lifted a weight from me, only to replace it with something heavier but full of breath and possibility. Miriam explained that federal orders had unsealed 22 years of suppressed records. The full scope of Richardson's influence was now documented. The payments, the coercion, the officials who quietly redirected complaints and buried leads. All of it laid out in file boxes and digital chains that no one could erase anymore. "Justice can be slow," she said. "But when it arrives, it does not forget." Her voice softened then just slightly. "You'll hear from Witsec soon. Be ready." After the call ended, I stood there with the phone still in my hand, staring at the faint frost forming along the bottom of the kitchen window. A thin line of snow had started falling, quiet and steady, tapping lightly against the glass. Claire asked softly, "What happened?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words formed at first. Instead, I stepped closer to her, letting her hold the part of me that had spent years bracing for the worst. "She's alive," I finally said. The words sounded unreal even as I spoke them. Claire pulled me close and didn't let go, her breath warm against my shoulder. I hadn't cried in 22 years, not really. But something inside me loosened, then a pressure releasing in a slow, unsteady way that left me standing there with my eyes closed, grateful and terrified all at once. That evening, the snow thickened, covering the street in a quiet white. That reminded me too much of 2003. The porch light cast a warm glow across the drifts and the neighborhood looked untouched, peaceful in a way that made the past feel dangerously close. I stepped outside and felt the cold settle against my skin. The air tasted like the memory of that night, the one when sirens flashed across my mother's house, and lies were handed to me in neat sentences. But this time something was different. This time the truth was no longer buried. I looked up at the sky, watching the snow fall in slow spirals under the porch light. Somewhere in that storm, somewhere beyond the reach of anything I could imagine, my mother was alive. And the past that had chased us both for more than 2 decades was finally beginning to break. The cold in the corridor felt different that morning, sharper than any December wind I had walked through. It carried the hush of something about to break. The courthouse lights hummed overhead, a pale glow that washed the hallway in a color I can only describe as winter on tile. Claire held Lily's coat while she watched me pace, and I could feel her eyes trying to steady me, though nothing was steady anymore. Inside the hearing room, people spoke in low voices that never blended. Chairs scraped, papers shuffled. Every sound struck my nerves like small, controlled jolts. This was not a trial, not yet only a federal preliminary hearing, but the weight in the room felt heavier than any verdict I could imagine. When Richardson walked in with his attorneys, his expression barely moved, though his fingers rapped once on the table before he caught himself. It was the only human thing about him, that brief lapse. Miriam sat near the front with a binder thick enough to anchor a ship. She did not look at me at first, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the kind that comes from months of work and the knowledge that one wrong breath could send everything sliding backward. She nodded toward the row of seats behind her, and I took one where I could see the judge's bench and the door everyone kept glancing at. The hearing opened with the dry formality of government proceedings. The judge asked for statements of position. Richardson's lead attorney stood, a man whose suit alone cost more than my first car, and began talking as if he were giving a lecture rather than defending a man accused of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. He said there had been misunderstandings, old allegations already reviewed, a grieving son misled by unreliable sources. His voice flowed smooth as varnish, coating everything with something too polished to trust. He paused, then turned his gaze toward me. "This young man lost his mother years ago," he said, "and in his grief he has misinterpreted events and assigned blame where none exists." The room tightened around me. My hands clenched before I realized it. I looked at Miriam, waiting for her to object, but she remained still, letting the statement hang like smoke. My throat felt scraped raw, and for a second I thought I might stay silent, let the system carry the weight for me. But then I saw a small object on the table beside Richardson's attorney. The wool gloves my mother never left the house without. They lay folded neatly beside a stack of documents, as if they belonged to the defense and not to the woman who had vanished from her own porch. Something inside me broke its last restraint. I stood. The words rose before I planned them, pulled up from a place that had waited 22 years to breathe. "I am not confused," I said, my voice barely louder than a breath, but strong enough to stop the attorney mid-sentence. "You do not get to rewrite who she was." The judge watched me closely, not admonishing, simply letting the moment find its shape. The attorney frowned, trying to pivot, but his smoothness faltered. He asked the court to disregard emotional outbursts. He said I did not understand the full context. He said the gloves were part of evidence processing and nothing more. But the room had shifted. I felt it, a current faint but growing like the moment before ice cracks. The door at the back opened and the sound cut through every conversation. Two marshals entered with a man I had only seen in case files and late-night photographs sent by Miriam. Colin Reddick looked smaller than the stories made him older. His eyes sunk with the weight of a lifetime lived in shadows. He walked with slow steps, glancing once toward Richardson. Something silent passed between them, a flicker of recognition or fear or both. The judge allowed him to speak under oath. His voice wavered at first, then steadied. He confirmed some of what we already knew: the fraud, the pressure placed on staff, the threats that circled anyone who asked questions. But when the attorney pushed him to clarify details about my mother, Colin hesitated, looking down at his hands as if the truth were carved into them. He said only that she had been moved quickly, that someone had warned her hours before the worst of it, and that he had not been the man sent to carry out anything involving her. His eyes flicked toward the back of the room, toward me, then back to the judge. He avoided naming who had planned the order. He avoided describing the night too fully, as if more details would break something he was still trying to protect. It was not the full confirmation I had feared or hoped for. It was something in between, a partial opening in a door that had been sealed for 2 decades. Enough to change the temperature in the room, but not enough to end anything. The judge asked if there was additional testimony he wished to give. Colin breathed in deep, slow. His lips parted as if he might say more, but whatever the truth was, he swallowed it. He looked at Richardson again, then dropped his gaze. That pause, that silence felt heavier than the testimony itself. It was the silence of someone who knew names he was not ready to speak and outcomes he was afraid to trigger. Miriam leaned toward the judge. She asked that the remaining sealed evidence be considered in private session. The judge agreed and called a brief recess. Chairs scraped again, louder this time, the room releasing its breath in uneven bursts. As people stood, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The vibration was faint but insistent, and when I pulled it out, the number on the screen made every sound in the room vanish. It was the same area code from the night Lily heard that whispered warning. I stepped into the hallway, snow drifting in thin sheets past the windows. I answered with a voice that barely sounded like mine. "Marcus," a woman said, soft enough that I pressed the phone to my ear to be sure I heard her. "It's Mom." My knees weakened, but I stayed upright, one hand braced on the cold concrete wall. There was noise behind her, not danger, just movement, the kind that echoes in temporary places where people wait for instructions. "I cannot stay on the line," she said. "The marshals are preparing the next step. But I needed to hear you today." I tried to speak, but breath came instead of words. Snow tapped lightly against the window, a quiet percussion that matched the pulse in my ears. She continued, her voice thinner now. "I cannot tell you everything yet. Not until they give permission. But you need to be ready. There are things still hidden, things no one has said." My hand tightened on the phone. What things I managed to ask. The line crackled. She sounded farther away, as if the distance between us had suddenly doubled. "When the judge opens that last file," she whispered, "you will understand why I did what I did." The connection faded before I could ask anything else. I stood there in the empty hall, listening to the silence she left behind. A silence that carried more weight than any answer. Inside the courtroom, the judge returned to the bench, and the door to the sealed evidence room swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. Every person turned, every sound stilled. Something was about to break. and I was not sure which part of my life would crack first. The courthouse hallway was almost empty when I stepped out, its lights humming softly above the scuffed floor. The door behind me closed with a tired click that felt like the final echo of everything that had been boiling for 23 years. I stood there for a moment, letting the cold from the lobby seep into my jacket. My hands were still trembling from what I had said, from what had finally been dragged into the open. For the first time in a long while, the weight on my chest felt lighter, though my legs were unsteady, as if they were relearning how to move without carrying so much. Outside, the late afternoon sky had softened to a pale winter gold. Snow drifted across the steps in thin ribbons. Claire waited near the curb, watching me through the windshield. When I reached the car, she touched my arm, not asking anything, only holding my eyes long enough for me to steady myself. Lily slept in the back seat, her mittened hands curled beneath her cheek. I stood there in the quiet, letting the cold settle my breath, and for the first time since childhood, I found myself wanting to go somewhere warm. The next morning, we began the drive north. Montana opened wide in front of us, a sweep of white hills and slow-moving daylight. Claire drove the first stretch while I sat with the folded note the marshals had given me, the one that carried the address of the cabin. I did not read it again. I simply held it, feeling the faint crease under my thumb, the same way I used to hold the gloves my mother knitted when I was 10. Somewhere between the state line and the mountain pass, I leaned back and closed my eyes. A long breath rose and fell in my chest. It felt like a part of me I had not allowed to breathe in decades. By late afternoon, the sky dimmed into that quiet blue that appears just before night. The road narrowed, climbing between pines that leaned under the weight of new snow. Claire slowed near a wooden mailbox tilting in the drift. I stepped out, the cold sharper now, the air so clean it almost burned. The cabin stood a short distance up a narrow path, its windows lit with a soft amber glow that pushed out into the twilight. I walked alone, hearing only the crunch of snow under my boots. Halfway up the path, I paused. My breath rose in pale ribbons. My hands were shaking again, not with fear, but with the strange knowledge that this moment would not come twice. I looked down and saw the faint outline of a child's footprint near the step, probably from a neighbor or someone who came earlier. Still, it anchored me. Life continued even in the places that felt forgotten. When I reached the porch, she was already there, Judith, smaller than I remembered. Her shoulders stooped beneath a wool coat, and on her hands were those familiar gloves, the same pattern, the same gray knit, as if time had circled back just for this hour. She did not speak at first. Her eyes searched mine, and in them I saw 23 years of fear, guilt, and longing converge into something fragile. Lily brushed past my leg before I could lift a hand. She ran straight into my mother's arms, burying her face against the wool. Judith gasped, then broke down, her body shaking as she gathered the child close. I stood still, watching the two of them fold into each other. My throat tightened until it hurt. The woman who had vanished into the cold world to keep me alive was now holding my daughter in the glow of a winter porch. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke. A small tree stood near the window, its lights casting warm speckles across the room. My mother guided us to the hearth, where a metal lockbox rested on a low table. She opened it with slow hands. Inside lay a sealed letter dated 2004, the edges slightly curled. She held it out to me, though her eyes stayed on the fire. I read it silently. Her apology was simple and plain, written in the same hand that used to sign my school forms. She had chosen silence because it was the only way to keep me breathing. She had watched from far away, paying for my tuition, leaving traces I never noticed. When I folded the letter, I felt something shift in my chest, something old and brittle finally letting go. Claire sat beside Lily on the rug, the two of them close enough that their shoulders touched. My mother looked at them as if memorizing the shape of her family piece by piece. For a moment the room held nothing but the crackle of the fire and our quiet breaths. My mother placed one more item on the table, a small envelope worn from years of being moved from place to place. It was empty. She said she used to keep a photograph inside one of me when I was 8, but somewhere between safe houses it had disappeared. She said she always meant to replace it. I took the envelope and slipped it into my coat. I would fill it again someday. Not today, but soon. As evening settled, we sat together beneath the soft lights of the tree. Judith leaned back in her chair, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked older now, but not in the defeated way I had once feared. More like someone who had walked a long road and finally reached a warm doorway. She spoke barely above a whisper. "From now on, I will be here every Christmas." I did not answer. I simply nodded, a small motion, steady and sure. Later, when the fire had thinned to glowing embers, I stepped outside for a breath of cold air. Snow drifted across the porch, smoothing the path we had walked earlier. I reached for the porch light switch and turned it on. A warm circle of gold spread across the snow, soft and quiet like a promise kept. I stood there a moment longer, letting the cold carry away the last remnants of what had once held me back. Then I closed the door gently behind me, leaving the winter outside and keeping the light in.